Vladimir Putin thought he had the perfect strategy for the Ukraine war. At least he had the perfect strategy after his initial attempt to seize Ukraine within a week utterly failed. All Russia needed to do was wear Ukraine down through sheer numbers. Eventually, the defense would collapse and Russia could take Ukraine quickly afterward. That was over 3 years ago. Russia has made minimal territorial gains since then, especially when weighed against its significant losses. Now, Putin is dealing with a war that's lasted longer than it should and has served as a catalog of his inability to deliver on his promises. Putin's massive failures in the Ukraine war are tearing Russia apart, and the future looks bleak for Putin's country. John Foreman sums it up easily in an October 10 interview with Times Radio. Foreman, who served as the UK's defense attaché to Moscow and Kiev between 2019 and 2022, understands Putin better than most outside of Russia, and he has a clear opinion on how Putin has failed in Ukraine. When asked about how Russia's recent hybrid warfare strikes in Europe are linked to the Ukraine battlefield, Foreman says bluntly, "Yes, I think Russia has experienced a strategic catastrophe by invading Ukraine." Putin's biggest failure, Foreman says, is that Russia simply hasn't taken the amount of territory that it should have. 2025 in particular has been a bad one for Putin. As Foreman says of Russia, its entire year's advance has been tiny, and it seems to be winding down now and resetting for 2026. Foreman isn't wrong. Russia started the year by making some of its smallest territorial advances at any point during the Ukraine war. By April, a clear slowdown was emerging, as Al Jazeera reported at the time. It highlighted figures published by both the UK Ministry of Defence and the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. Both organizations offered slightly different outlooks on Russia's advances, though they both concluded that they were slow. The Ministry of Defense said that Russia had managed to claim just 126 square miles of Ukraine in January. By February, that number was down to 76 square miles, and it went down again to 55 square miles in March. According to the ISW, Russia's gains were a little better, but by no means impressive. January saw Russia claim 165 square miles of Ukraine, the ISW said, followed by 137 square miles in February and 78 square miles in March. In both cases, there's a clear downward trend. But Putin at least had big plans for the summer. He organized a massive summer offensive with the goals of creating a buffer zone in Sumy, and finally taking the key logistical city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. Putin dedicated almost thousands upon thousands of troops to these goals, only to see Russia's military utterly fail to achieve them. Yes, Russia gained more Ukrainian territory in the summer than it did in the early winter and spring. But it didn't gain the territory it wanted, nor the territory that it needed to make more substantial gains later on. Now, as Foreman points out, Russia is on the downswing again. On October 1, CNN reported on claims by the Deep State Monitoring Group that Russia had managed to capture just 100 square miles of Ukraine in September. That's right back down to the sort of numbers that we saw at the beginning of 2025, and it is indicative of yet another blunder by Putin. Worse yet, says Deep State, these types of numbers showcase just how badly Putin's Ukraine war is really going. Last month, the enemy occupied 44% less territory than in August, Deep State claims. Over the course of the month, the Russians managed to occupy 0.04% of the country's total area, bringing the total figure to 19.04%. Of course, Russia is trying to put as positive a spin on all of this as possible. When the Deep State report came out, Russia was claiming that it had managed to take about 5,000 square kilometers, or about 1,930 square miles, of land in Ukraine this year. Even that, as inflated as the number appears to be, is hardly impressive for Russia. As the Kiev Post reported on October 8, Russia surpassed the million casualties mark during the summer, and it has lost 281,000 soldiers and counting in 2025. And that's without even covering that Ukraine has been on a tier of retaking territory since the end of the summer. These are massive failures in anybody's book other than Putin's. And perhaps the biggest failure of Russia's leader is that he shows no sign of changing course. Peace certainly isn't on Putin's agenda, as Foreman told Times Radio. I think Putin's overall political intent remains the same, to bring Ukraine to heel, and we have the chances of peace becoming more remote. That will lead to Putin also ramping up Russia's hybrid and cyber threats against Europe, which could be yet another mistake that ends up hurting Russia rather than helping it. That point will be addressed in a moment. First, Foreman seems to be right on the money when it comes to Putin's refusal to accept peace, which in turn consigns Russia to yet more months, or even years, of a war which has already cost it dear. Almost everybody who is in some way a stakeholder in the Ukraine war believes that Putin doesn't intend to declare peace. The European Union's, or EU's, Kaja Kallas said as much in the wake of Putin's groundbreaking visit to meet US President Donald Trump in Alaska back in August. But the harsh reality is that Russia has no intention of ending this war anytime soon, Kallas wrote on X on August 16. Even as delegations met, Russia launched new attacks on Ukraine. Putin continues to drag out negotiations and hopes he gets away with it. He left Anchorage without making any commitments to end the killing. The Atlantic Council has a similarly grim view of Putin's lack of desire for peace, noting that, despite Trump's efforts, Putin has time and time again tried to stall peace. Records for the sheer size and scale of Russia's drone assaults on Ukraine are being sent as Putin talks about peace. The outlet concludes that Putin has made it as clear as day that he has no interest in ending the Ukraine war, even as thousands of Russia's people die. Putin's approach to peace is yet another of his massive failures, a point that will be explained later in the video. A complete inability to back down from his maximalist demands, which include Ukraine ceding vast tracts of territory to Russia, and then neutering itself to the point where it could be invaded again with far less resistance, lies at the heart of these demands. Putin also now sees the military-industrial complex he has created in Russia as his country's main economic driver, says the Peace Research Institute Oslo, and so ending the war is the exact opposite of what Russia's leader wants to do. Putin has backed Russia into a corner from which there is no escape. And there are hints that even people inside Russia are starting to see the Ukraine war as a hopeless endeavor. Coming back to the Alaska peace talks for a moment, Foreman says that some inside Russia believe that they ended up being worse for Russia than anybody might have thought. While Foreman downplays the idea that those talks were a disaster for Putin, he did tell Times Radio, "I just call it a complete waste of time and effort. Trump trying a Hail Mary peace deal without any preparation at the last minute was never going to work. That's not the Russian approach. I think the Russian wording now is, it was a waste of time, didn't lead anywhere." That's in stark contrast to how Russia's political elite felt following the Alaska meeting. On August 16, Reuters reported that Russian politicians were hailing the Alaska meeting as a triumph for Russia that would take the country a step closer to achieving the version of peace that it wants. One of those people was Andrei Klishas, who the outlet says is the senior lawmaker for the United Russia Party that Putin helms. The meeting in Alaska confirmed Russia's desire for peace, long-term and fair, Klishas said. Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the upper house of the Kremlin, Konstantin Kosakiev, was also happy. The very fact of the meeting in Alaska, its tone and its outcome represent a significant and joint success for both presidents, each of whom made a tremendous personal contribution to achieving the best possible result at this time. What's changed since August? It's possible that these types of comments were just examples of Russian politicians licking the boots of their leader to curry favor. However, Putin often uses those who support him as mouthpieces, so it's perhaps more likely that these kinds of messages were intended for Trump. Putin wants to convince Trump that he'd done a good job and was moving the war closer to a peace settlement, all as Russia continued to bomb Ukraine as it always had. Putin thought that he had Trump figured out. He didn't. That's yet another strategic failure on Putin's part that has caused serious damage to Russia, and it may be why the waste of time opinion is now becoming prevalent, per Foreman's claims. So Putin is having to try different things to distract from his many Ukraine failures, which leads back to the point mentioned earlier, Russia's cyber and hybrid warfare attacks against Europe during the last few months. The Atlantic Council outlines some of these attacks in an October 9 piece in which it labels Putin as a geopolitical gangster who is trying to intimidate Europe. A wave of Russian drones flew into Poland at the beginning of September. Russian fighter jets entered Estonian airspace a few days later. There have also been Russian drone sightings in countries like Germany, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands, all of which are EU and NATO nations that express immense support for Ukraine. These are the types of attacks that Foreman is talking about, and they appear to have become a key part of Putin's Ukraine war strategy. Russia's leader is trying to use hybrid warfare to stop Ukraine's allies from offering support. Plus, as Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky noted on October 12, Putin is also trying to take Western eyes off the Ukraine war. Russia is now taking advantage of the moment, the fact that the Middle East and domestic issues in every country are getting maximum attention. Zelensky wrote on X, he's not wrong. Foreman also told Times Radio what Russia's plan for Europe is likely to be going forward. "I do see the ramping up of these threats, whether it's cyber, whether it's espionage, whether it's sabotage, whether it's incursions, whether it's at sea. The evidence is out, it's part of that to ultimately stop us from supporting Ukraine. Herein lies what may end up being another of Putin's strategic failures. Putin's goal is to make Ukraine's European allies so wary of Russia that they stop supporting Ukraine, keep them focused on themselves, and Ukraine will grow weaker. However, Putin simply steeled the collective resolve of NATO's European members. They're now considering military responses against Russia's hybrid warfare threats, as discussed in a video earlier in October. Check out that video to learn more. But even more than uniting NATO and the EU against him, Putin is doing exactly what he's trying to make the rest of Europe do with Russia's cyber and hybrid attacks, taking eyes off the Ukraine war. Dividing his country's military attention between Ukraine and Europe means that Putin isn't thinking about how to fix the many strategic mistakes he's made during the war. Perhaps Putin is so egocentric that he believes he's made no mistakes at all. Or he might have surrounded himself with so many yes men that he has no idea that Russia's territorial gains are nowhere near as impressive as he tries to make them sound when he talks about them. Whatever the case may be, the focus on Europe may be Putin's biggest mistake of all. Ukraine is a far more significant problem for Russia, and Putin seems incapable of changing an approach to the Ukraine war that has been slowly killing Russia for over 3 years. And that leads to how all of this is tearing Russia apart. That's happening even if Putin doesn't see it, and it starts with Russia's geopolitical status. Thanks to Putin's actions after Alaska, the pandering to Trump that Russia thought would keep the US at least partially on Russia's side is now failing. Any support Russia had from the US since Trump became president is gone, and Trump is openly talking about offering more support to Ukraine than he has at any other point since he took office. Trump has said that he believes Ukraine has the ability to retake the territory that it has lost to Russia, which is a complete turnaround from his earlier assertions that Ukraine holds no cards. The Lowy Institute even believes that Trump may be right, noting that Russia is bleeding soldiers on the battlefield and is also dealing with Ukrainian strikes against energy infrastructure that are hurting the country economically. The Associated Press adds that Trump now claims that he's considering sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Those missiles can travel for around 1,500 miles, which would put all relevant parts of Russia in Ukraine's crosshairs, assuming that Trump follows through. That's a big assumption, of course. Trump may just be talking to demonstrate to Putin what might happen if Russia's leader doesn't play ball. But even if that is the case, the change in US rhetoric is a startling showcase of just how badly Putin has failed to play the US at a game that he thought he was winning. The topic of Ukraine's energy infrastructure strikes was mentioned a moment ago. Those have been extensive. On October 5, The Economist reported that Ukraine had hit around half of Russia's major oil refineries in August and September alone, noting that as much as 40% of Russia's refining capacity has been taken offline. Gasoline exports are lower. The same goes for diesel. And in many Russian regions, gasoline shortages are forcing queues at the pumps and restrictions on how much gasoline a customer can buy. Those refinery attacks may also be carried out with US help, which is yet another shot at Putin's belief that he had played Trump like a fiddle. On October 12, Reuters reported that the Financial Times claims that the US has been providing Ukraine with intelligence that enables Ukraine's long-range strikes to zero in on effective targets. How true this is remains to be seen, but there's no denying that Ukraine has enjoyed massive success with these strikes. Ukraine hits its targets more often than not, and that may be because the US is now giving it a helping hand. These kinds of attacks may still not be enough to push Putin away from his failed course when it comes to the Ukraine war. When asked if he sees the strikes leading to economic problems for Russia, Foreman points out that Putin can take on more debt, cut spending elsewhere, and continue to lean on Russia's national reserve. He adds that the likes of China and India buying Russian oil, as well as North Korea supplying Russia with weapons, all play in Putin's favor. But even with all of those caveats, Foreman still says to Times Radio, "There's no doubt about Russia under severe economic difficulties. But I don't think that the Ukrainian drone strikes are going to bring about a collapse of the Russian economy on their own. Perhaps not." But as Foreman says himself, those strikes, coupled with concerted international action, could collapse Russia's economy. And besides sanctions, there are hints that some in the EU are ready to do something that will really hurt Russia, unfreeze Russia's frozen assets so that Ukraine can use them. Such a course of action will obviously help Ukraine, which is dealing with economic pressure of its own. However, they'll also take away another of Russia's economic lifelines, while once again showcasing how Putin's Ukraine war failures have ended up turning the geopolitical tide against his country. There is still a debate ongoing in the EU about how to use this frozen Russian money. The Straits Times says that EU leaders are weighing up the possibility of using those assets to deliver a loan of 140 billion euros, or about $150 billion to Ukraine. But this sort of action can only happen if the EU's various leaders unify to make the decision, as unity is the antidote to Putin's efforts to make Europe's many nations focus on themselves rather than Ukraine. Still, there might be one more issue that threatens to tear Russia apart more than any other. And that issue is the simple fact that Putin is a 73-year-old man who isn't going to live forever. Realistically, Russia's leader may only have a few more years to achieve his goals. But if Putin dies, there doesn't seem to be any sort of replacement for the cult of personality type figure, as Foreman dubs Putin waiting in the wings. Foreman is quick to mention that any major refresh between Russia and the West, which includes Ukraine, is likely a generation away. But Foreman also says that when it comes to Putin, his prospect is to remain in power and then die and then leave it to his successor. I think the problem is that every day he remains in office, the chances of bloodshed when he finally does and his successor comes along increases. Putin's successor may not be so crazed about Ukraine, Foreman says, and a power struggle inside Russia could be just as damaging as anything that the West or Ukraine is doing to hurt Russia. Perhaps that's Putin's biggest failure of all. His seeming lack of planning for what comes next is going to be a major problem for Russia. Putin seems to have recognized this, and as the Kyiv Independent reported in May, Russia's leader has a list of potential candidates to succeed him. But potential is the keyword here. There is nobody whom Putin is obviously grooming to be his successor, and that fact is sending Russia headlong into a future dilemma. In September, Reuters reported on strange comments that Putin made to China's President Xi Jinping when Russia's leader attended a military parade in Beijing. Human organs can be continuously transplanted, Putin reportedly said through his translator. The longer you live, the younger you become, and you can even achieve immortality. Is Putin's solution to the succession problem simply not to die? Immortality may be on Putin's mind, but that is pure fantasy. And maybe this sort of comment is Putin's roundabout way of acknowledging his biggest failure of all. Russia's leader hasn't prepared his country for what comes after decades of Putin's rule. Organ transplants won't save Putin, and the many mistakes Putin has made in Ukraine and within his own country will end up tearing Russia apart. That is, if Putin's domestic security blind spots inside Russia don't topple the country first. Russia's leader has been dedicating far too many of Russia's resources to Ukraine and now Europe, and that is another major error on his part. Find out why in our video, and remember to subscribe to Clash of Nations for more videos covering how Putin may be leading Russia down a path of destruction.